Some say the true measure of courage isn't standing tall when you're strong, but rising up when the world has crushed you into dust. That woman's been warned. No decent white widow shares land with a Negro. Time to teach them both about proper society. In 1883, Montana, a widow who'd lost everything but her dignity, faced the most brutal choice on the frontier: safety through submission or freedom at any cost. Get inside before they see you. I buried my fear along with my husband. I won't be hiding anymore. Stay until the end to discover how one woman's refusal to bow to hatred changed the course of a territory's history, and why this story was deliberately erased from the books written by those who lost that night. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary true story, I need you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell. Why? Because here at the Black Rancher, we're unearthing the buried stories of black heroes who helped shape America, stories intentionally hidden from history books. If you believe everyone deserves to see themselves in America's great narrative, share this video with someone who needs to hear these forgotten tales of courage. Subscribe now, and let's preserve this legacy together. Welcome to the Black Rancher. Now, let's journey back to Montana Territory, 1883, where our story begins. Clearwater Valley, Montana Territory, spring 1883. Margaret Wells stood at the edge of her property, surveying the fence line that needed repair before summer. At 34, her face showed the lines of a woman who'd weathered more than just Montana's harsh elements. 6 months a widow, she'd refused to sell the struggling cattle ranch despite mounting pressure from the bank, neighbors, and even her late husband's family back east. The Raven Creek Ranch wasn't much, 80 acres of decent grazing land with a small cabin, barn and corral, but it was hers. The only thing Thomas had managed to leave her debt-free after typhoid took him last fall. A distant rider appeared on the horizon, his silhouette dark against the late afternoon sky. Margaret shaded her eyes, recognizing the distinctive posture of Solomon Reed. The sight of him still caused whispers in town. A black man who'd purchased the neighboring property last year, paying cash for 300 acres that the Cattlemen's Association had been eyeing for years. Solomon rode a magnificent black stallion, his posture straight and proud despite the weight of stairs that followed him everywhere. As he approached, he removed his hat, a gesture of respect few white men bothered with when addressing her since Thomas died. Mrs. Wells, he called, stopping a respectful distance away. Thought you should know. Harlan Becker and his men were at Simpson's store talking about riding out this way tonight. Margaret's stomach tightened. Becker, head of the Cattlemen's Association, had made no secret of his desire to absorb both their properties into his holdings. What were they saying exactly? Solomon's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes held concern. That it ain't proper for a white widow to be neighbors with a man like me. That decent folks might need to remind us both of our place. My place, Margaret said firmly, is right here on my land. Solomon nodded slowly, studying the horizon. Yes, ma'am, but these men, they don't see boundaries the same way we do. Did they threaten violence? Not in those words, but they've been drinking since noon. Solomon shifted in his saddle. I can send my ranch hand Jacob around tonight. Extra eyes might discourage them. Margaret thought of the loaded Winchester above her mantle. I appreciate the warning, Mr. Reed, but I can look after myself. Never doubted it, Mrs. Wells. A hint of admiration flickered across his face. Still, might be best to bring in your livestock closer to the house tonight and... He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Might be best if you're not seen outside after dark. You mean hide? In my own home? The suggestion sparked something in her, a flare of the same defiance that had kept her here against all advice. I've been told to make myself small my whole life, Mr. Reed. First by my father, then by society, then by my husband's family. I won't do it anymore. Mrs. Wells, Solomon said quietly, there are battles worth fighting, and there are those that'll just get you killed for no reason. And which is this one? Solomon replaced his hat, his expression solemn. That depends on what you're fighting for. He turned his horse to leave. I'll be keeping watch tonight either way. As she watched him ride toward his own property, Land he'd earned through years of brutal work as one of the few black cattlemen in the territory, Margaret felt something stir within her. Not fear, though that was certainly present. Something deeper, a recognition. They were both outsiders here, both defying the unwritten rules of who could own land and determine their own futures. And in frontier Montana, such defiance rarely went unpunished. Margaret touched the small derringer she kept in her skirt pocket, another thing Thomas had never approved of, and headed back to the cabin. She had preparations to make before nightfall. Dusk settled over Raven Creek Ranch, painting the mountains purple against the fading light. Margaret had brought her 6 cows and single bull into the corral nearest the cabin, secured her 2 horses in the barn, and prepared for a long night. The Winchester rested across her lap as she sat by the window, watching the approach to her property. A sound at the back door made her start. She raised the rifle, moving silently across the wooden floor. "Mrs. Wells?" Solomon's low voice came through the door. "It's Reed." She opened it to find Solomon standing there, another man, younger with similar features behind him. "This is my brother Daniel," Solomon explained. "He arrived from Kansas last week." Daniel nodded respectfully, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. "Mom, they're coming," Solomon said without preamble. 8 riders, about 20 minutes out. Becca's with them. Margaret's mouth went dry, but she kept her voice steady. "You shouldn't be here. They'll see it as confirmation of whatever rumors they're spreading." "Likely so," Solomon agreed. "But Daniel and I were thinking, if they see all 3 of us standing together, might make them reconsider whatever they're planning, or make them more determined." "Could be," Daniel spoke up. "But 8 against 1 are poor odds, ma'am. 8 against 3, still poor, but better." Margaret studied the brothers. Daniel wore a gun belt with a well-worn Colt, while Solomon carried a shotgun. Both men stood straight, their expressions resolute. "You're risking your lives and your property," she said finally. "Why?" Solomon exchanged a glance with his brother before answering. "Because my father taught me that if good people don't stand together, the bad ones will always win." A distant thunder of hooves broke the moment. "Get inside," Solomon said urgently. "Bar the door. We'll talk to them first. Try to send them on their way." Margaret stood her ground. "This is my property, Mr. Reed. I won't cower inside while others fight my battles." "Mrs. Wells—" "Margaret," she corrected him. "If we're facing this together, you might as well use my name." Something shifted in Solomon's expression. Respect, perhaps even admiration. "Margaret," he acknowledged. "These men are dangerous, especially when drinking." "I'm aware," she hefted the Winchester. "But I've been hiding one way or another since I was a girl. Not anymore." The pounding of hooves grew louder as riders approached the ranch house. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, illuminating hard faces beneath the brims of dusty hats. "Get inside before they see you," Solomon warned one last time. "Please." Margaret stepped forward, positioning herself between the Reed brothers on her front porch. "This is my land, my choice," she said, voice firm as steel, "and I refuse to hide again." As the riders pulled up in a semicircle before the cabin, Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time in years, perhaps in her entire life, she was standing exactly where she belonged, exactly as herself. Harlan Becker's face, illuminated by lantern light, registered first surprise, then disgust at the tableau before him. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this a pretty picture?" Harlan Becker sat atop his chestnut gelding, surrounded by 7 hard-faced men Margaret recognized from town, ranchers, hired hands, and Jonas Fletcher, who owned the dry goods store, all armed, all watching with expressions ranging from discomfort to outright hostility. "Evening, Becker," Margaret said evenly, the Winchester held casually but visibly at her side. "Rather late for a social call." Becker spat a stream of tobacco juice onto her yard. "This ain't social, Mrs. Wells. This here's about standards, community standards. On my property after dark with 8 armed men?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Seems more like intimidation than neighborliness. We came to have a word with you about your associations." Becca's gaze flicked dismissively to Solomon and Daniel. Didn't realize we'd find the proof right on your porch. Solomon stepped forward slightly. Mrs. Wells was kind enough to warn us about uninvited visitors on her land. As her neighbors, we came to offer assistance. That right? Becca's smile didn't reach his eyes. Mighty suspicious timing, Reed. Folks in town are already talking. Let them talk, Margaret said. Now state your business or leave my property. Becca shifted in his saddle, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation. Our business, Mrs. Wells, is the reputation of this valley. Decent folk have standards about how widows behave, especially with certain elements. My behavior is my concern, Mr. Becca, not yours, not the town's. That's where you're wrong. Becca's voice hardened. When a white woman consorts with coloreds, it affects all of us. Sets a bad example. Makes people wonder what else goes on out here. Daniel's hand drifted toward his holster, but Solomon touched his arm lightly, a warning. Margaret stepped forward, putting herself more prominently in front of the brothers. My late husband left me this land free and clear, Mr. Becca. Who I allow on it is my decision. A woman alone can't manage ranch land, Becca countered. Everyone knows that. We've been patient, giving you time to come to your senses and sell. I'm not selling. Then maybe you need convincing. One of Becca's men dismounted, moving toward the corral where her cattle were penned. Margaret raised the Winchester to her shoulder in one fluid motion. Step away from my livestock. The man froze, looking to Becca for direction. You'd shoot a man for walking on your property? Becca asked, feigning shock. I'd shoot a man for threatening my livelihood, Margaret corrected. Just as you would. An uncomfortable silence fell. This confrontation wasn't going as Becca had planned. He'd expected to find a frightened widow, not an armed woman flanked by two determined men. The Cattlemen's Association has concerns about your relationship with Reed here, Becca tried again. Improper associations drive down property values, harm the community's standing. Is that what this is really about? Solomon spoke up. Property values? Or is it that you can't stand seeing land you want in the hands of people you consider beneath you? Becca's face darkened. Watch yourself, boy. You may have papers for that land, but papers can burn. Is that a threat? Daniel asked, voice dangerously quiet. It's a fact of frontier life, Becca replied. Accidents happen, especially to those who don't understand their place. Margaret stepped forward, Winchester still raised. My place is here. Mr. Reed's place is on his land. And your place, Mr. Becca, is not on my property threatening me or my neighbors. Your neighbors? Becca laughed, a harsh sound in the night air. Is that what you call them? I call them men of honor, Margaret said clearly. Which is more than I can say for night riders who threaten women. Fletcher, the shopkeeper, shifted uncomfortably. Harlan, maybe we should... Quiet, Becca snapped. He stared at Margaret, calculation in his eyes. You've got 1 week, Mrs. Wells. 1 week to either sell your property to the association at a fair price or face the consequences of your choices. The only choice I see, Margaret replied steadily, is whether you leave my land peacefully right now or force me to defend it. For a tense moment, the only sound was the snorting of horses and the distant call of a night bird. Margaret's finger rested lightly on the Winchester's trigger, her gaze locked with Becca's. Finally, Becca jerked his reins, turning his horse. 1 week, he repeated. And Reed, you'd best stick to your own property from now on. Wouldn't want folks getting the wrong idea. And what idea is that? Solomon asked quietly. Becca's smile was ugly. That you've got designs on more than just the widow's land. Before either Solomon or Margaret could respond, Becca spurred his horse, leading his men in a circle around the cabin and away into the darkness. Their hoofbeats faded, leaving an unnatural stillness behind. Margaret lowered the rifle, suddenly aware of how badly her hands were shaking. You all right? Solomon asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice just yet. That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen, Daniel said, an unexpected note of admiration in his voice. Perhaps both, Margaret admitted, finding her voice at last. But I meant what I said. I'm done hiding. Solomon studied her thoughtfully. They'll be back, and not with words next time. I know. Margaret gazed in the direction the riders had disappeared. But so will I. So will we, Solomon corrected gently. If you'll accept the help. Margaret turned to him, seeing not just a neighbor now, but an ally, perhaps even a friend. Why? This isn't your fight, isn't it? Solomon's eyes held hers. When men like Becca decide who belongs where, who can own land, who deserves respect, it's everyone's fight who wants to live free. In that moment, standing in the yard her husband had once claimed was too much for a woman to manage, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since before Thomas fell ill. Certainty. Then we have 1 week, she said, to make sure they regret ever riding onto this property. I need to pause our story right here because what happens next shocked even me when I discovered these buried records. Before I reveal how Margaret, Solomon, and Daniel stood against impossible odds and the price they paid for their defiance, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to The Black Rancher. Why? Because these stories of courage across racial boundaries are systematically erased from our history books. Every subscription helps us continue unearthing and sharing these powerful, forgotten narratives. Now let's return to Montana territory, where the most dangerous week of Margaret Wells' life is about to begin. Dawn broke over Raven Creek Ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Margaret stood on her porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying her property with new eyes. For 6 months since Thomas's death, she had been maintaining, surviving. Now she was fighting. Solomon and Daniel had returned to their own ranch after agreeing on a plan. They would prepare for Becca's return while maintaining a public distance to avoid inflaming tensions further. Each morning, they would signal each other with a mirror flash at sunrise, a simple code to confirm all was well. Margaret caught the glint of Solomon's signal from the ridge that separated their properties and flashed her response. All clear. For now. The day passed in a flurry of activity as Margaret reinforced her defenses. She moved supplies into the root cellar, created firing positions at key windows, and rode the perimeter of her property, noting potential approaches and vulnerabilities. In town that afternoon, the atmosphere shifted noticeably when she entered the general store. Conversations halted. Eyes slid away from hers. Mrs. Fletcher, the shopkeeper's wife, approached hesitantly while her husband tallied Margaret's purchases. "Margaret," she whispered, "people are saying terrible things." "People always do," Margaret replied, counting out coins for flour and coffee. "It's different now. After last night," Mrs. Fletcher glanced around nervously. "Harlan Becker is telling everyone that you and that Reed man—" "Mr. Reed is my neighbor," Margaret interrupted firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less. But to invite him into your home, I didn't." Margaret met the woman's gaze directly. "Mr. Becker and his friends came uninvited to threaten me. Mr. Reed and his brother came to ensure my safety. Which should concern this town more?" Mrs. Fletcher had no answer. As Margaret loaded her supplies into her wagon, Sheriff Taylor approached, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Mrs. Wells, heard there was some trouble out your way last night." "Nothing I couldn't handle, Sheriff." "Becker says differently." The sheriff studied her, something unreadable in his expression. "Says you threatened him with a rifle. That you're consorting with the Reed brothers." Margaret secured her purchases before turning to face him. "Mr. Becker and 7 armed men trespassed on my property after dark, threatened my livestock, and implied they might burn my neighbor's deed. Yes, I had my rifle, wouldn't you?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "As for the other matter—" "There is no other matter, Sheriff." Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Unless you're officially investigating my acquaintances now?" Sheriff Taylor removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. "Margaret, I've known you since you and Thomas arrived 5 years ago. You've always been respectable folk. But this situation is about land, not respectability," she finished for him. "Becker wanted to absorb our properties into his holdings even before Thomas died. Now he sees an easier target. And Reed is a landowner with legal rights, same as anyone." Margaret gathered her reins. "Will you uphold those rights, Sheriff, or only for certain citizens?" Sheriff Taylor replaced his hat, his expression troubled. Just be careful, Margaret. Frontier justice doesn't always follow the law books. I'm counting on you to ensure it does, she replied, and snapped the reins, leaving him standing in the dusty street. The days that followed fell into a vigilant rhythm. Each morning, mirror signals confirmed all was well. Margaret tended her small herd, repaired fencing, and kept the Winchester within reach. Solomon and Daniel maintained their distance publicly, but sent notes via Solomon's young ranch hand, a half-Mexican boy named Carlos, who could move between properties without attracting much notice. On the fourth day, Margaret's chestnut mare went missing, despite the locked barn. On the fifth, she found 2 of her cows with their throats slit in the north pasture. She buried the evidence, said nothing in town, and sent word to Solomon through Carlos. They're testing us, seeing if we'll break. Solomon's response came back that evening. We won't. On the 6th day, Carlos didn't return from town. Margaret rode to the boundary line and flashed her mirror urgently until Solomon appeared on horseback at the ridge. Carlos is missing, she called when he was within earshot, maintaining their agreement not to cross onto each other's land during daylight. Solomon's expression darkened. Since when? Sent him to town this morning for supplies. Should have been back hours ago. I'll find him, Solomon promised, already turning his horse. Solomon, Margaret called after him, tomorrow's the deadline. He nodded grimly. I know. Be ready. That night, Margaret kept vigil by her window, watching the approach to her cabin. Around midnight, movement caught her eye, a lone figure staggering toward her door. She raised her rifle, then lowered it immediately when she recognized Carlos's slight form. She rushed outside, helping the boy into the cabin. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. Blood had dried on his split lip. Who did this? She demanded, heating water for compresses. Becca's men. Carlos winced as she cleaned his injuries. Caught me coming out of the telegraph office. Said to tell Mr. Reed this is what happens to breed boys who carry messages for Negro ranchers and white women. Margaret's hands stilled. You were at the telegraph office? Carlos nodded, producing a crumpled paper from his pocket. Mr. Reed asked me to send this yesterday, to his cousin in Bozeman. Got this reply today. Margaret smoothed the telegram. Arriving tomorrow afternoon. Stop bringing 7 stop hold position stop. Hope flared within her. Solomon had called for reinforcements. If they could just hold out until tomorrow afternoon. A distant glow on the horizon caught her attention. She moved to the window, heart sinking as she recognized the unmistakable flicker of a large fire in the direction of Solomon's ranch. They're not waiting for the deadline, she whispered. Flames illuminated the night sky over Solomon Reed's property, the orange glow visible even from Margaret's cabin. Carlos, despite his injuries, insisted on returning to warn Solomon and Daniel. They're already aware, Margaret said grimly, gathering ammunition for her Winchester. That fire is their warning. She debated riding to their aid, but recognized the tactic for what it was, a diversion. Becca wanted to split them up, draw them away from defensible positions. Instead, she wrote a quick note, gave Carlos her spare horse, and sent him on a different route, away from the Reed Ranch toward Bozeman. If Solomon's reinforcements were coming, they needed to know what they were riding into. Margaret spent the night fortifying her position, moving furniture to block windows, filling every available container with water in case of fire. She wouldn't be driven out, not by Becca, not by fear, not by the crushing weight of societal judgment that had followed her since girlhood. As dawn broke, she caught movement on the ridge, Solomon and Daniel silhouetted against the rising sun. They were alive. The ranch hand signaled with the mirror, a new pattern they'd established for emergencies, danger coming soon. She flashed back, ready. Within an hour, the first riders appeared, not from town, but circling from the north, using the cover of pine forest. Margaret counted 12 men, Becca in the lead, more than before. They meant to end this today. She positioned herself at the front window, rifle resting on the sill. When they were within earshot, she called out, "That's far enough, Becca." The riders halted. Several carried torches despite the morning light, their intentions clear. "Last chance, Mrs. Wells," Becca shouted, Sign over your deed and clear out. Nobody needs to get hurt." "You burned Mr. Reed's property," she called back. "Assaulted a child. And you speak of nobody getting hurt." Becca spat. "Reed's place just had a little fire in the north pasture. Consider it a warning." "As for that Mexican brat, boys need discipline." "I'm not leaving my land," Margaret stated firmly. "Neither is Mr. Reed." "Then you've made your choice." Becca nodded to his men. "Burn her out." 3 riders broke from the group, circling toward the barn with torches ready. Margaret took a breath, steadied her aim, and fired. The shot kicked dirt at the lead rider's horse, causing it to rear and nearly unseat its rider. "That was a warning," she called. "The next one won't be." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Becca drew his revolver. "Take her!" Gunfire erupted from the ridge, Solomon and Daniel, positioned among the rocks, targeting the men with torches. One dropped his flame, clutching his arm. Another's hat flew off. The riders scattered, seeking cover and returning fire. Margaret methodically worked her rifle, focusing on those nearest the house and barn. She'd never shot at a man before today, but found her hands remarkably steady. A bullet splintered the window frame beside her. She ducked, moved to another position. Outside, she could hear Becca shouting orders, reorganizing his men for another push. The assault continued through the morning, a deadly game of advance and retreat. Becca's men would push forward, meet resistance from 3 directions, and fall back to regroup. They'd managed to set fire to Margaret's woodshed, but a sudden spring rain shower had extinguished it before it could spread. By noon, 2 of Becca's men had retreated with injuries. The others maintained a perimeter around the property, occasionally firing to keep Margaret pinned inside while Solomon and Daniel remained trapped on the ridge. "We can wait you out, Mrs. Wells," Becca called during a lull. "We've got supplies, men in rotation. How long can you 3 hold?" Margaret didn't answer, conserving ammunition and watching the sun's position. Solomon's telegram had promised reinforcements by afternoon. But what if Carlos hadn't made it through? What if... The distant thunder of hooves interrupted her thoughts. At first, she thought it was her imagination. Then she saw Becca and his men turn toward the eastern approach, tension in their postures. A cloud of dust preceded the riders, at least a dozen, maybe more. As they drew closer, Margaret gasped. Leading them was a tall black man who could only be Solomon's cousin, but beside him rode Sheriff Taylor and what looked like several deputies. Becca's men wavered, uncertain whether to stand their ground or flee. "Harlan Becca," the sheriff's voice boomed as they approached, "lower your weapons immediately. You and your men are under arrest for arson, assault, and attempted murder." "This isn't what it looks like, Sheriff," Becca began, but fell silent as more riders emerged from the trees, Solomon and Daniel moving to join the newcomers. "It's exactly what it looks like," Solomon contradicted, gesturing to the man beside him, a distinguished older gentleman in a city suit. "And Mr. Edwards here, federal marshal from the territorial capital, is very interested in your interpretation of frontier justice." The federal marshal urged his horse forward. "We received multiple telegrams about vigilante activity targeting legal landowners. The governor takes a dim view of such actions, especially when they appear motivated by racial prejudice." Becca's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You're taking their word over mine. I'm head of the Cattlemen's Association." "And I'm a federal representative of the law," the marshal replied coldly. "Drop your weapons, all of you." One by one, Becca's men complied, their fight evaporating in the face of official authority. As the sheriff and deputies moved to disarm and bind them, Margaret emerged from her cabin, Winchester still in hand. Solomon rode toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "You all right?" She nodded, surveying the scene with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. "Carlos made it through. Smart Boy took a route we didn't even consider," Solomon confirmed. "Rode straight to the telegraph office in Pine Creek instead of Bozeman, contacted the marshal directly. By then my cousin and his friends were already on the way." He nodded toward the group of black riders who had accompanied the law officers, all former Buffalo soldiers, all landowners now. Margaret studied the proud, capable men dismounting in her yard, men like Solomon who had carved out their place in a world determined to deny them one, men who understood exactly what she'd been fighting for. "Thank you," she said simply. "For standing with me." "No," Solomon corrected gently. "For standing together." As Becca was led away in handcuffs, he spat in Margaret's direction. "This changes nothing. People will never accept—" "People adapt, Mr. Becca," she interrupted calmly, "when they see strength instead of fear, when they witness dignity instead of hatred. That's how the frontier has always worked." She turned her back on him, facing Solomon instead. "I believe I owe you and your brother dinner, Mr. Reed. And your friends too, of course." Solomon's usually solemn face broke into a rare smile. "I believe we'd be honored, Mrs. Wells." As the afternoon sun gilded the Montana landscape, Margaret walked toward her home, not hiding, not ashamed, but standing tall on land she'd defended through her own courage and the alliance of those society had taught her to fear. She'd refused to hide again, and in that refusal found not just safety, but freedom. What you've just witnessed is more than a story. It's history that powerful men tried to erase. The alliance between Margaret Wells and the Reed brothers challenged the racial boundaries of the frontier in ways that threatened the established order. Within a year, 7 other families, black, white, and Mexican, had settled in their valley, creating one of the first truly integrated communities in the Montana Territory. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button now and share it with someone who needs to hear it. At The Black Rancher, we're committed to uncovering these hidden chapters of American history, the moments when ordinary people chose extraordinary courage over comfortable prejudice. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, remember that the truest American legacy isn't division, it's the defiant hope of those who stood together when the world told them to stand apart.